You're listening to Across Archives, a space that highlights storytelling projects, archives, and oral histories that share the experiences of migrants, immigrants, internally displaced people, and refugees around the world. Here, we explore a wider community of storytellers, archivists, advocates, and scholars whose work inspires our own at the Refugee Archive. Together, these efforts bridge divides, build solidarity, and reshape how the record of displacement is remembered.
Mr. Paul Dudman, you have a lot of acronyms after your name. Can you tell us what those are?
Okay, so I've done 2 postgraduate courses, one in library administration and the second one in archives administration. I'm also a chartered member of the Library Association. A few more that have crept on over the years that I've not added on.
You've got the MCLIP.
Yeah, so that's the charter status of the Chartered Institute of Library Professionals.
And you've been at the University of East London for over 20 years, working in the archives.
This is correct, yes. Started here way back in November 2002, when the university had just received the archives from the Refugee Council, which is one of the largest NGOs, third sector charities here in the UK, working specifically with supporting refugees and through their sort of repatriation and sort of settlement here in the UK. This was the first archive that the university had ever taken on, and I was the first archivist. I was employed on a 1-year temporary contract, little realising that almost 23 years later, I'd still be in this role and the archive would have taken on a life and character of its own. So,
I've noticed when I looked on the map at your university, it's located in an area where maybe there are a lot of migrants and refugee communities around it. Is that correct?
This is correct, yes. Where we're based in the London Borough of Newham, it's the most diverse of all of the London boroughs. It's perhaps the most diverse, one of the most diverse areas in the whole country. And that is also reflected in the sort of staff and student body here at the university as well, as we have a very diverse student body which reflects the area of London in which we're situated, which is interesting because East London has traditionally been the home of many refugee and migrant communities over the last 200 years. East London has become the place of first settlement of different communities for the past 150, 200 years. So I think it's important that having our archive collections here, which have a strong emphasis on refugee migration, we're situated in a part of London that had a long history of supporting and working with.
You find yourself working in a career in an archival of a university, and you're working on refugee stories and histories and collections. And then at some point you decide to start your own blog, the Living Archive, the Living Refugee Archive.
I think it was a process that developed over the period of time that I was working with our collections here. We began with the archive of the Refugee Council. As a working charity, a lot of the material they had collected reflected the history of the Refugee Council as a charity working with refugees. But they also collected a very large special collection about material they'd collected over the course of 50 plus years of their work, which helped to inform their engagement with the sort of different communities they were working with. So what we had was a lot of both sort of policy and research material, which talked a lot about refugees. But we came to start to realise that maybe our role as an archive was not just to document this kind of material, but also to look at how we would reassess our work to start thinking about collecting and working with the refugees directly as a means of documenting and preserving their own stories within the archival space. in order to perhaps provide a more informed narrative, lived experiences of asylum seekers beyond what we had purely within the sort of Refugee Council archive. We were fortunate that this was back in, I think, 2015. The university had launched a sort of civic engagement focus, which meant that they provided small amounts of funding for sort of projects that would an engagement and outreach component to it. That provided us with the opportunity to think about how we engaged with the community on the archive, and then start to think about how we could start to use an oral history approach to start documenting the lived experiences of refugees and asylum seekers. And this was how the idea of the Living Refugee Archive came about. We wanted, on the one hand, to improve the awareness and the accessibility to the archives that we had, but also for this platform to act as an engagement platform that we could work with sort of different organisations, different communities, and have a platform that we could make this engagement work more accessible to an audience.
So walk me through the demographic of the refugee stories that you were collecting as far as geographic area and male, female, age. Any of these factors played a role in the refugees that stories got selected?
So really, I think how we've approached it, it's very much been a combination, building relationships with different communities that have enabled us to undertake projects, but also through our engagement work to be able to act as a repository for organisations and community groups to come to us to act as an archival repository for a particular project that they might be interested in undertaking. Demographic-wise, I think we started out with a focus on London, but we've always been open to potential collaboration more widely across the UK to open up the conversation between different communities in different parts of the country. So we've tried very hard not to be too specific about the demographic and the scope of the projects that we try to be involved in. So I think it's always been a combination of either through connections that we built up, having the opportunity to work with different organisations. And for example, today we've built up collections that relate to lived experience of Syrian communities, Ugandan, Asian, Chilean community, but then also Kosovan and Chinese communities as well. And that's been very much a combination of communities and organisations coming to us and saying that we would like to do an oral history project to the history of our own community. Is this something you would be interested in helping to support us with and to provide an archival space for the material through to us actually building relationships directly with different communities, and then over time developing a collaborative archiving approach to how we work with those communities that helps safeguard their history.
Sure. Is there any particular story or project that you worked on which you can look back on and say, I am so glad I started this Living Refugee Archive. It was all worth it.
I think, in a way, the ongoing project with Chilean colleagues has really touched us in a lot of ways. I think because it came about almost this is going back, I think, in 2017. One of an academic colleague from another university, been working with the Chilean community, and they developed an exhibition of around 150 handcrafted items, which were made by Chileans whilst they were in the prisons in Chile in the 1970s. And they were looking for somewhere in London to host the exhibition. By chance, they'd asked the then chief executive of the Refugee Council to be a speaker at the event. And by chance, when they were talking about where they could host it, have you thought about contacting the archives UEL, where our collection house, to see if they would be interested? So of course they did. It's just one of those emails that you could have easily listed in the daily emails that we all get. But this one recalled in the sense that when I received it, I thought, this is something to be involved with. Subsequently, the exhibition here, we had all of the objects out on display in the archive. We had a film screening and a couple of workshops in the archive by one of my colleagues who was using craft work as a means of documenting the lived experience of Chileans. And it's funny, we sort of went into these events thinking, okay, if we get sort of 50 people for the film screening, we'd have done fantastically well. So I thought, okay, I'll book a room for say 75 just to be on the stage side. It was so full, people end up sitting on the floor. And then for the two workshops, we thought, if we get enough for one, we've done well. Both of them sold out. And it was just one of those events that you come out afterwards thinking, wow, I think that sort of touched all of our hearts in so many ways. We came out of that thinking, in a way, we can't just leave it here, but we weren't quite sure how to take it forward. So we went away and thought it over a bit. And over time, that become an approach where we're actually working with the Chilean community now on a wider archiving project to help safeguard and document the experiences in London over the last 50 years. So I think that has been a kind of the sort of, and I think that meant a lot to strange how these things work. I was actually born on the same day as the coup in Chile. So I think is that's like almost fate saying that this is where you need to be. I don't know, but I think
sign. It was a sign.
So I think that has really sort of, and it's been so interesting. But we've been able to work with obviously the first generation of Chileans who came over after the coup, also the second generations who were born and brought up here, and we're now seeing the third generation coming through as well, still with understanding the value of sort of recording and documenting everything they've been through.
Recording the stories. Besides recording this, what are the pillars of the Living Refugee Archive? Do you have more going on the blog than just the stories? Sounds like you have some other distinct pillars.
Yeah, so we also try to do exhibitions, visual exhibitions as well. For example, to go back to the Chilean case, we were fortunate at the time that we had photographs taken of all of these individual items. So we subsequently turned that into a virtual exhibition. So in a way, that project, there was still a visual record of these materials. And we've also, over the past several, we've started publishing our own open access journal as well, which we aim allowing both community members and participants to be able to document their own work through the journal, but also using that as a means of sort of bringing material to life in new and different ways. And I think, as we all know, that trying to get anything published in the academic literature is a long and pretty drawn out process. So we wanted something that was perhaps sort of bridge that gap that can make histories more accessible in a format that could be readily available to anyone who wanted to come in and access that material. Yeah, so we've been keen to develop the Living Refugee Archive as a living resource in its own way that continues to provide a point of engagement, a point of access to the work that we do, and perhaps gives a sense of something that isn't just top down from the university, but there's an ongoing piece of work.
Well, when you started Living Refugee Archive in 2011, is that right?
It was 2015.
2015, okay.
Yeah.
But a lot's changed, 2015 to 2025. How is your kind of the foundation or standards of what you developed, how have they changed over time? Maybe even from ethics, policy, consent, any of that, with more digital technologies that we have.
Yeah.
How have you changed? Yeah.
No, I think certainly it's sort of the whole concept of sort of ethics that sort of underpins all of the work that we do. And it's something that we're very keen to keep at the forefront of the work that we do, especially given the context in which we're sort of undertaking this work. So it's something that informs and underpins all of the work that we do, especially with the projects that we now work on. So recent examples, we've worked on water history projects with the Ugandan Asian community. for all of those, it was very much a case that the projects were run by other charitable organisations who had received funding to undertake the projects, but we were brought in as the archival lead to ensure that all of the material would have a safe home and that we safeguarded the future. Certainly all of these projects, ensuring that the ethics are built into the process right from the start and carried forwards. For example, when histories are recorded, the consent forms and all the documentation are designed in a way that the participants have the flexibility and understanding to know what contributing to and to ensure that they continue to be involved throughout the lifetime of the project and beyond. On that, when there's undertaken to make sure our contact details are also on the consent form. So if they want to get back in touch with us 5-10 years, get down the line, that we still can be contactable. And it's alongside that, it's ensuring that all of the relevant legislation and sort of data protection issues are taken into account with all of the work that we do. It's interesting. There's one example. This is on an archival project, but not specifically about refugee migration. We had an old history work had been undertaken documenting the history of North Woolwich and Silvertown, which is sort of just opposite where the campus is, Arsenal Docklands campus is. And as part of that project, over 100 old histories had been taken there to inform the output, which was going to be like a sort of public artwork. So but we eventually decided that it wouldn't be possible to make the histories available, simply because if they were made available, people might be able to recognise who was speaking through their voice. So that was the decision was made that we would receive the oral histories, but we wouldn't make those directly available, and if necessarily make the transcripts available, but obviously that wouldn't include any information on the person. So I think in a way, it's with any project that we do, there's always the potential for something, I wouldn't say unusual, but we've got to be prepared that think, okay, we need to make a decision here about how we sort of proceed with this. So it's just ensuring as much of that as possible is in place as early as possible within the project, which then makes it a lot easier to be able to take the necessary steps to ensure that we are safeguarding the sort of participants who we are working with.
And speaking about safeguarding, you mentioned in earlier correspondence that you were a board member on the Human Rights Board of an International Archivist Association. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I've recently been appointed to the International Council on Archives section for human rights. So the ICA is the International Association for Archivists, Records Managers, and they've had this section of human rights archives for a number of years now. That area looks into all aspects of the role of archives in relation to supporting others' human rights. And that very much focuses on how we work with these kind of collections, whether it be as a result of refugee migration, whether it's archives based around conflict, or as the means of helping to develop best practice and raising awareness of archives from a sort of human rights standpoint.
Got it. That's really interesting. When got started in this, unpacking and unfolding all of the web of archivists and organizations around the world, and it's big.
Yes, in some ways it's also, I think, perhaps a problem that we're starting to, through this kind of work, trying to deal with in some way, because even if we just look at it from a sort of UK context, through some of the work we've done with different sort of community groups, who often find that an archive in London will hold something on the Chilean community, say, but equally there'll be material in Sheffield or in other parts of the country which hold other parts of history. And I think it's one of the real challenges at the moment. How do we start the process to start linking all of those together in a way that if I or you go to an archive that I'm interested in this particular, we're going to say, oh yes, we've got this part of the history, but you can also go to good work in being done in other parts of the country or nationally or internationally, and then start to join those dots in some way. But I think it's over the years, so often I've had people, researchers coming in and ask me questions that I'm really interested in doing research on this particular community. Where can I find the material? I can have a look and think, okay, we maybe don't have so much on that, but it then becomes the sort of, I'm saying the issue, but then it becomes a bit more, okay, where else has that, might they be interested, might have that material? So I think that is something we would, it's probably, certainly an area that we're looking at, but again, it's a very big piece of work. So I think the more we can bring these organisations get together and join up, the better.
No, it's a great concept. You're really making my mind is spinning with ideas, actually. And I'm thinking, how important is it to collaborate with other archivists when you're working in a community, trying to suss out their oral histories of a particular community, pairing that with the actual artifacts from those communities, and then being able to pair the stories with the archives found? That's a really interesting, deep way to learn about a community.
Absolutely. And I think that is definitely the patch that we're gradually trying to move towards. I think I think for us, we've always tried to keep the idea of what we mean by an archive. It's to do exactly what you've just been talking to. We're starting to think about how we bring different types of material together in order to tell a much bigger story. Because I think when we have the exhibition from the Chilean community, actually having all of those handcrafted patchworks and different material, that told almost a completely different story that you would have been very hard to get if that had just been written down in a document. It was interesting. When we had the 2 workshops in here, that was really interesting, because that almost acted as a conduit for people to tell their stories. They'd be the group would be work on a particular patchwork, and one person would story that would trigger somebody else to tell their story. And the very act of actually making something brought the group closer together to be able to share their stories. So I think, certainly looking at the work that we do in a more holistic way in terms of what it is that we are trying to archive. So if we can link an oral history with an artifact, and then link that with a document, that gives a much deeper sort of narrative than just looking at those sort of individually. And I think it's hopefully collaborate. Oh, I can never say that word. In the collaboration between like archives and museums, so they can say, "Oh, we've got this particular document that speaks to an artifact held in the museum in Sheffield." So that opens up so many doors potentially to how we can go about doing this work.
Absolutely. The other thing that I think opens doors is probably the research that could potentially go on for some kind of a qualitative analysis or sentiment analysis of a particular group through these oral histories. Do you have students who've published works using any of your oral histories, or it's an idea that you might engage later?
Yeah, it's certainly an idea. We have a student at the moment who's currently working on a doctoral thesis, and we were able to secure funding to pay for doctoral research utilising the Living Refugee Archive and the archives that we have here at UA. And there's a case study for her research, and that's been really interesting. It's essentially a collaboration between us and 2 academics at the University of East Anglia, the others at University College London, both specialising in refugee history. We were able to funding that enabled us to recruit a doctoral student that undertakes some of that work. So I think you're right, that is something we would like to do more. There is so much incredibly powerful and valuable information that we have in some of these oral histories. So I think, again, at the end of the day, our remit is both to continue to support the work to safeguard these materials, but it's also to make those accessible, to encourage that kind of engagement with the content itself.
How accessible are these oral histories? Where can anyone listen to them or read them? Or a mixture of both? Yeah.
We're currently working, several projects have their own sort of websites where edited versions of the oral histories can be found through those sort of websites. But several of our collections they are available to research. They come in on site here. They can access the oral histories from there. So it's a combination at the moment, but for the majority of our collections, it's available coming in and so utilize it.
Now, you don't have a very narrow demographic or psychographic angle on the refugee stories, but we are focused on female-headed households in displacement and single moms in displacement or internally displaced or refugees. Have you heard of other story archivists doing refugee stories with very particular angles?
I think there have been some projects that have tried to be specific in terms of the particular sort of demographic or angle that they want to. Projects we've been involved in that tends to have been more around communities wanting to document their own community lived experience in a particular area. It was the 2 Ugandan Asian projects we worked with. That was a little similar in the sense that one project focused on sort of the experiences of the Ugandan Asians themselves, whilst the other project worked on talking to those from charities and related parties in the UK who had assisted with the resettlement of Uganda once they'd arrived in the UK. So that was a sort of, and it sort of works in the sense, bringing those two together, it gave you a much fuller. But I think certainly there is, as you say, a lot of merit in undertaking the approach in the way that you're undertaking it to actually look at a particular context. And I think maybe that is something we might also consider potentially for a future project if we think there's a particular, if there's something that's missing or sort of underdeveloped, not as well documented within the archival collections that we have. That is interesting. At events and conferences, we often get asked, why have you chosen to work with this community as opposed to a different one? And that's also, in this context, perhaps often a very difficult one to answer in the sense, because often it's, a strike to say for you, you've got a lot of time and investment goes into whichever project you're focusing on. So it's often, but it's not a case that we're intentionally not looking as a particular community. It's just been an opportunity to have arisen to work in a particular area, and that's felt like a good fit for us. And we know that there's perhaps a need to be able to sort of document that story as well. I think, in a way, what this tells us is that there was sort of so much more work in these areas that needs to be done in a way. I think, again, that touched upon what we talked about earlier, is how do we sort of reach those networks in the sense that we think, okay, yes, somebody's doing some research here in the UK working on sort of single mothers and stuff. Okay, you have to fight them to...
Absolutely, point them over.
And I think that's where the whole sort of collaboration side of it comes in, the sense that, in a way, it's sort of being able to be in a position to say, we may not have X, Y, we know who is working on.
How, speaking of collaboration, how active are you with the Archival Association and if your fellow archivists? How much collaboration do you have with these other professionals?
Certainly, we do have a lot of collaboration between us as the archive and other academic colleagues as well. And that is, in a way, both UEL and probably down sort of nationally and sort of internationally as well. There's sort of several of the projects that we're working on now to come about through connections with archivist colleagues here in the UK. We're also involved with an organisation, the International Association for the Study of Forced Migration, which is an international platform of academics and practitioners working in refugee migration issues. Through that network, we have set up an archive working group that acts as a means of communication to reach out and engage with sort of fellow academics and help raise awareness. So that's definitely a key aspect of the work that we are trying to do.
Yeah, I'm learning that the networking and the collaborating is a key part.
Mm.
And like you said, the word access earlier, we have found that without local partners on the ground in the center of these sometimes remote places or dangerous places for a foreigner just to walk in. It's so important to have these partnerships with these on the ground schools or projects that can get you access.
Yes.
That's the only way.
That's very true. Yes, I think we'd all like to do a lot more for this kind of work. But you're right, it's the time that you need to actually perhaps undertake the groundwork to establish these networks, these engagement opportunities before you can then start the action itself.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's a process all the way around. Yeah. So tell me, to wrap up this conversation, what is the future of 2026 goals, the Living Refugee Archive?
Yeah, so we're currently working on the next volume of our journal, which is to mark the 10th anniversary of the Living Refugee Archive. And then beyond that, we've got plans to work with some of our academic colleagues here at the university. Here at the University of East London, we have an academic centre for sort of refugees. We're also looking ahead to 2026, looking at the collaboration with some of our Chilean colleagues around the Refugee Week in 2026. Alongside that, we're also hoping to get more content uploaded into the Living Refugee Archive as well. So it's very much an ongoing piece of work at the moment, but we're just trying to lay the groundwork for the next year, 18 months to look like.
Very good. Sounds great. So for people to find you, they would go to livingrefugeearchive.org.
That's right.
Or for social media, it's at refugee_archive. Is that right?
Correct. That's correct. Yes.
Yep. Okay, great. Good. I hope we can have many conversations and we will stay in touch.
Absolutely. That sounds good.
Okay, great.
That'd be great.
Thank you for listening to Across Archives, a project by the Refugee Archive. Our conversations here highlight the storytellers, archivists, and advocates who are shaping how migration and displacement are remembered. If you'd like to go deeper and hear the voices of women living these experiences firsthand, join us on The Archive Speaks, our oral history audio archive featuring powerful stories from female-headed households and single mothers in displacement around the world. Together, Across Archives and The Archive Speaks preserve memory, amplify unheard voices, and reshape how we understand the experience of displacement. Listen to The Archive Speaks wherever you get your podcasts, or visit the Refugee Archive to explore both projects and learn more about our work.